Hey, Walter Sorrells back with more tips for the knife maker. Today, grinders. Now, a while back, I did a series of videos about tools that are used in the shop, and I did a pretty long segment about grinders. Now, that basically focused on the hardware aspect of grinders. What we're going to talk about today is maybe what you might call the software side. In other words, it's how to use grinders, the techniques involved, and just some of the basics. If you're thinking about buying a grinder and you want to learn how to use it, kind of shorten that learning curve, that's what we're going to be talking about today. All right, let's get to it. Now, this machine right here is a Bader B3. It's one of the most popular 2x72 grinders available for knife makers. 2x72 indicates that this belt is 2 inches wide and 72 inches long. The longer and wider a belt is, the more use you're going to get out of it over time. Now, a lot of times knife makers will start out with a fairly inexpensive grinder that has much smaller belts, and most knife makers quickly find that that just is not sufficient for their needs, and they start to move up to more expensive, more powerful grinders like this. There are cheaper ones available. Grizzly makes one, Northern Tool possibly, I'm not sure, Coot, there's another one. And those are a little bit less heavy duty than this, but they still are 2x72 grinders and are capable of doing pretty hard work. Okay, so let's start by just kind of giving you a little tour of the features of the belt grinder, what the various parts are, and what they do. So, you start with a motor right here, and that motor is going to drive a drive wheel, which is on the back side here. That drive wheel turns the belt. We've got a tracking wheel up here. By adjusting this little jury rig knob that I put on here, you can cause the belt to move from side to side. Over time, the different size belts or wear on the machine or whatever will cause the belt to move from one side to the other. And so this tracking wheel here allows you to move the belt back and forth and keep it in proper alignment so that you can cut properly and grind properly with it. In the front, on this grinder, we have a large arm that allows you to change different grinding surfaces. So this is a flat platen. It's probably the most commonly used piece of equipment on most belt grinders. Now, we'll show you in just a minute, but you can remove this front arm and you can put various different kinds of attachments on here. You can put grinding wheels of various diameters. You can put a slack belt. You can put very tight little diameter cutting or grinding surfaces, so on and so forth. It's a very versatile and powerful machine. Okay, so now I'm going to show you how we change from one grinding fixture to another. It's very simple on this machine, takes about a minute. So this little handle just is spring loaded and you push it down, that takes the pressure off the belt. You take the belt off and turn a couple simple levers. This just slides right out and you can put another one on. So that was the flat platen, and here is a grinding wheel. That goes on like so. Here's the belt, you're ready to roll. Let's talk a little bit about the belts themselves. So, there are a variety of different kinds of belts. They're all 2 inches wide, 72 inches long, but you have different grit sizes, and then you have different types of grit that are found on the belt itself. So this right here is a 60 grit ceramic belt. This belt is is made for very hard use. It stands up to a lot of use. It's fairly expensive, but you can do a lot of grinding before it wears out. Back here I have a cheaper belt. This is aluminum oxide. Aluminum oxide doesn't really grind slower or faster per se than the ceramic does, but it just doesn't last as long. So these belts probably cost me somewhere in the neighborhood of $2 a piece. Those ceramics cost somewhere in the neighborhood of, I forget, $8 or something like that. So you're going to want to get 4 times as much use out of the ceramics in order to justify buying them. And in fact, in most applications, I find that I can justify that. I only use them for rough grinding, however. Once I move up the grits a little bit, I go to these super cheap aluminum oxide belts. An important thing that you have to understand when you're first getting into this is you're just going to have to buy a lot of belts. Belts do wear out. As soon as they wear out, not only do they cut slower and they just take more time to use, but they also heat up whatever you're grinding quicker. And in certain circumstances, particularly after steel has been heat treated, you don't want that heat building up really quickly, because if you get an overabundance of heat, it will cause the steel to temper and destroy the hardness of the steel. So that's something you very much want to avoid. The fresher, newer your grit, the fresher and newer your belts are, the less likely that heat is to build up and cause damage to your blade. As I said, there are a whole variety of different kinds of belts, and I find that they all have their uses in different applications. This one, for instance, is a 3M belt known as a gator grit belt. It has kind of little pyramid-shaped piles of abrasive on it. This one is a 3M Trizac belt. It's what's known as a structured abrasive, where basically it has a cloth that's kind of impregnated with abrasive, so that as the surface abrasive wears away, you can go deeper into that cloth and still have some abrasive left. And I find these things last super long. They're only available on the fairly high end of the spectrum, if I recall correctly. I mean, this is like a 60 micron or some 40 micron, something like that. So this is the equivalent of, I don't know, maybe 400 grit, 600 grit, something like that. So when you get started, I would recommend starting at a minimum with 60 grit, 120 grit, 220 grit, and then a few of the higher grits after that. So let's talk about your basic grinding strategy. Most of the work is going to be done by your heavier grits. Essentially what you're doing is doing most of the work at the beginning of shaping the tool that you're making, or whatever piece you're making. And then after that, it's essentially about surface refinement. So you're going to end up using, at least in my case, I certainly end up using far more of the heavy grit belts than I do of the higher grit belts. Now, every knife maker is going to have their own approach to the belt grinder, but what I'm going to try and talk about a little bit here is just some general principles that will make the operation of the belt grinder easier for you. The single most important thing to understand is that, with any rotating tool, you don't want things chattering, in other words, moving in a sort of rhythmic way. If a tool is not supported, it's not heavy enough, if it's not firmly enough attached to its work table, if you don't put enough pressure on the thing, there are just a number of things that can cause the work to move around, the knife blade as you're grinding it to move around in your hands, or against the surface of the tool. And if that happens, you're really in bad shape. What will happen is that you can't maintain clean grind lines, and it's hard to control. So the first basic principle for me is to hold the workpiece with two hands. Sometimes if it's a short thing like a knife, something this size, I may put my thumb behind it. Sometimes I like taping my fingers up to keep the heat on, or to keep the heat from burning my hands, because this does produce a ton of heat no matter how fresh the belts are or whatever. It's going to produce a lot of heat. So I always want to support it with two hands. The second thing that I'm going to do is that I want to keep my elbows in close to my sides, and I want to do as much of the work with my body as opposed to my extremities. The further out you get into your extremities, the more floppy and loose and weak you get, whereas the tighter everything is, this is sort of one of those martial arts type principles, the closer you've got your extremities into your torso, the stronger you are and the more control you have. So what I like to do is do as much of the movement of the knife as I'm grinding it with my body. Now, if you watch me, I'm not going to do it all with my body, but a good chunk of my work is going to be done with my elbows in nice and tight, my wrist kind of cocked and firmly held, and just sliding things along that plate, and just like so. You'll also want to work in two directions because of the way the camera's situated here. I'm not going to show too much of that, but the more that you can learn to grind like so from both sides, so that you're flipping it over and working in the opposite direction, the better off you are. You want to be able to work fluently with both hands. I think most knife makers probably have a strong side and a weak side. For me, I'd much prefer to work this way than this way. But still, on every knife, I'm always going to work from both sides. Another important part is you need this, a big bucket of water. You're going to build up a ton of heat, and so as you work, just be dipping that knife down into the water every time it starts to get too hot. Some people like using gloves, some people like taping up their hands. There are all kinds of things you can do to ameliorate that heat, but at a certain point, you just got to cool the work down by sticking it in a bucket of water. So here's one other little feature. This is a little table. You can put it on here, and then it's adjustable front to back, so you can get it nice and tight to the belt. This allows you to support work right up there against the belt. You can put jigs on here, various little kinds of fixtures and stuff like that, and this helps you to grind 90-degree angles also. So very helpful little feature. So I'm going to explain this just with this little bar in my hand, but we'll intercut a little bit back and forth so that you can see me actually demonstrating the principles that I'm talking about here on actual blades. So let's talk about the basic things that you do with a flat plate. And typically, the first thing that you do when you're shaping a knife, if you're making it by stock removal methods, is to shape the actual outline of the blade itself. So a lot of times we'll use that little table that I showed you earlier, and you'll set the table up here, and then you can just grind away to shape the blade. And by putting it on that table, which you've already leveled, you know that whatever outline you get is going to be exactly 90 degrees square. Once you've got that done, then you're going to be grinding the actual bevel of the blade itself, which is to say you're going to be shaving it down this way and that way to make it into a cutting edge. So that's the place that really takes skill. The reality is that belt grinding is an acquired skill, and you're just going to have to practice. So this is, this is kind of the hardest, trickiest part of making blades. If you're making very small, simple blades, those grinds are not that hard to make. The more complex the grinds, the more skill that's required, and larger blades and so on take a lot more skill. But here are the basic principles. Once I've decided the type of grind that I'm going to put into the blade, and I always am going to have designed this beforehand so that I know where I'm going. I'm going to lay it out, and I'm going to draw on the knife so that I know roughly where I want my grind lines to go and that sort of thing. And the key thing that you're looking for with grind lines is that you want them to be nice and crisp, and you want them to be clean. In other words, you don't want them to wobble or waver or curve around. Or if there is a curve, you want it to be a nice curve that matches the curve of the blade itself. The way that you get there is by grinding smoothly from one side to the other. The way I like to do is to start with the ricasso, which is the little piece between the knife and the cutting edge itself, so that I bear into this little edge right there and then move smoothly from one side to the other. If you hesitate, if you start rocking around or fiddling with it or trying to fix something as you go, you're almost invariably going to dig in somehow. Either you dig into that corner, you dig into this corner, and as soon as you do that, it goes up higher than the rest of the line and you get a wobble in the line. So the first principle of grinding is stay smooth. Once you establish that plunge line, which is that line there at the ricasso, you just go whoop, nice and smoothly across. The second grinding principle that I always want to assure myself of is that I want to grind from the edge up toward the spine, not the other way. Generally, there's going to be a grind line across the top of your bevel where the flat part of the blade meets the bevel going down towards the cutting edge. Now, if you blur that edge, it just looks bad. That's just a basic flaw in knife making. And so what happens is, if you just think, okay, this is my angle and I'm just going to drop right in there and grind that angle across there, what's likely to happen is that the blade will contact with the belt at the top of the blade. And that is disastrous for good knife design. What will happen then is you'll get grinding scratches across here, and if you look at the spine of the blade, there's going to be a point where the bevel actually cuts into the spine of the blade, and you don't want that at all. So what I always do is I start by allowing the edge of the blade to contact the belt, just to kiss it, just the softest, gentlest little contact, and then I feather it in to whatever angle I'm looking for. So I'm always going to try and keep maintaining that exact angle all the way across. So I'll hit that edge, feather it in, drop it down to the right angle, and then put a little more pressure on and go smoothly all the way across. If you bring it in too hard, though, you're going to do the same. You're going to cause the same problem that you could cause to the spine by dropping the spine on there. You're going to cut into the cutting edge. So it's the least worst kind of situation, putting it onto the edge, and you're just going to super gently get on there and then drop it down. Now, principle 3, and this is one of the most difficult things about grinding freehand, is you just have to develop a feel for when the flat that you've established on there hits that belt. And once it hits, you don't want to go any further in any direction. You just want solid, even pressure, and then, like I say, start moving all the way across there. Smooth, even flow right across the belt. Okay, next general principle is finger pressure. Now, I've talked earlier about how you want to basically do the work with your body and not have your fingers doing too much work. This is kind of where that general principle starts to break down and something new starts to happen. And here's how this works. Once you establish a flat on there, in other words, a bevel that's at a different angle from the normal flat blade or flat stock, you're coming down at an angle and you start to establish that flat all the way across the blade. Once you've established that, you find that flat again by just sort of dropping it down and finding it by feel. Now, this again is one of those things that you just have to practice and you have to learn how to get there. Once you've found that flat, once you feel that your blade is flat, that the flat is established right there on the platen, you're going to want to adjust that flat in one of two directions. And this is just something that, that as you grind the knife, you're going to move in either of two directions. Either you're going to grind in towards the cutting edge, or you're going to be trying to move that grind line back toward the spine. Now, if you just push on there, it's going to move in both directions at the same time, which is great as far as it goes, but at a certain point you just have to start making adjustments. And that's where finger pressure comes into play. Once you find that basic flat, if you want to move towards the cutting edge, you're going to use your thumbs and you're going to push in like that. Incidentally, I should have mentioned this earlier, but the cutting edge is always going to be up. You're not going to grind down towards the cutting edge. You're going to grind up. That allows you to see what your cutting edge is doing, and it results in less chatter, because the contact point between the spine and the flat of the blade and the bevel is kind of grabby. And so what will happen is if you work in the opposite direction, the belt has a tendency to grab hold and mess up the blade. So you always want to work blade up. So once I'm working along that blade, if I want to move the bevel in towards the blade as I'm refining it, I'm going to push with my thumbs. If I want to move back, if I want to push that grind line up towards the spine, then I'm going to, and this is just, this is my personal thing, but the general principle applies no matter where you put your fingers or how you grip it. You're going to start applying pressure down this way towards the spine. You're still flat on there, it's just that you're applying pressure on this part of the blade rather than here. And I usually do that with my fingers like so, or I may push it with this finger here. And basically, once you apply that set of principles, then it's just a matter of working your way across there, gently getting to the grind that you're looking for. Sometimes you'll find that as you grind in here close to the ricasso, the plunge line or whatever you want to call it along here, that the grind line will be a little uneven, or it won't be exactly where you like it. And that is another one of those skill things. You just have to learn how much pressure to put here. You'll put a little more on that corner and then just kind of work it across there and try and drag that little piece out so it gets a nice clean grind line there. Which reminds me of one more point here, which is that plunge line can be done in any number of different ways. You can have a real sharp, crisp plunge line, or you can have one that is very smooth and slow. And you can do both of those with the same belt grinder. And the way you do that is by using the tracking to move the belt further over. When you hang the belt off the side and press right in here, you're going to have a slow, gradual transition between the where the belt's cutting in hard and where it's not cutting in at all. And that'll give you a nice, smooth, refined looking transition. But there are plenty of people who also like a nice, hard, crisp transition, and that you'll want to do by keeping the belt right smack up centered on the platen, so that as you push on the belt, it doesn't yield at all. Okay, so let's talk about the grinding wheel. Now, there are a couple different things that you can do with the grinding wheel. The first is, just any kind of normal stock removal you can do that you would do on a platen. And I find that the wheel is more aggressive. You have that little bend in it, and you can really concentrate your force. And if you just really want to take off some stock, I like working on the wheel more. You can also grind bevels and things this way. Sometimes I do that on long blades, swords principally. But the single most important thing that you can do with the wheel is to hollow grind. Now, I have to preface this by saying I absolutely do no hollow grinding whatsoever. It's just not part of the palette of the type of knives that I use. But I shouldn't say I never do it, but I almost never do it. And this grinding wheel, the fact that this is the only grinding wheel that I have will tell you that if you know anything about grinding wheels. And the reason for that is, obviously the bigger the wheel is, the larger that radius is, and therefore the less deep that the hollow is that's ground out by the wheel. If you're making a hollow grind, meaning that you're grinding along the face like this, then you're digging into the blade like so. Now, what's the purpose of a hollow grind? If you really, really want a knife to be sharp, a hollow grind is a superior grind because it allows that final segment of the blade to be quite thin. And there's no, as you cut into whatever you're cutting with that blade, the fact that the cutting edge climbs very steeply means that there's less resistance of the cutting edge on whatever surface you're cutting. Makes it a more efficient cutter and a thinner, sharper cutter. If you like that hollow grind, then obviously you'll need the wheel to grind them. If you're going to be a hollow grinding guy, the first thing I would do is not get a 10-inch wheel. This type of wheel, a small wheel like this, has a very tight grinding radius. And what that means is that you can only effectively cut a very short bevel. Otherwise, the hollow will go all the way through, or at least will go so deep into the blade that it's not very strong. So if you're interested in hollow grinding, I would recommend when you buy your machine, buy something like a 14-inch radius wheel. You'll get much more versatility in grinding those bevels. Often you'll go to knife shows and you'll see guys who are selling hollow ground blades that are made with fairly small radius wheels, and to my eye they look really crappy. It's bad design. So get a bigger wheel if that's what you're interested in. Nevertheless, let's talk about the basic principles of hollow grinding. Hollow grinding, probably good to have jigs that allows you to keep the blade in a very exact position. Nevertheless, if you're going to freehand a hollow grind, and that can be done, it's a fairly high skill thing, and what you have to do is to learn to get that establish that initial grind, and then do, just like I was talking about earlier, you use finger pressure to move that grind area around a little bit. However, you also will have to move the blade up and down a little bit if you want to move that grind back. Now, another point is, when I was talking about flat grinding earlier, I said you have to be able to feel when you hit that flat grind point, or when the flat of your bevel is on the platen. Same principle applies when hollow grinding. Just gently feather it in there, and then once you find that you're sort of nestled into that little hollow, then you want to press down a little bit, establish that that you're cutting nice and smoothly across the entire radius, and then move it slowly across like that in a nice smooth fashion. If you don't do that, if you don't get right smack into that hollow, what'll happen is you'll get two sets of grind lines. So you'll in essence be cutting two radii inside that one little channel. It'll look horrible, and you'll just have to throw the knife out if you go too far with it. So that's the real key, is developing that skill at being able to find the bottom of that radius and then pull it over without disturbing the grind line. Okay, this is what's known as a slack belt fixture. So pretty obvious what that means. The belt can flex in like that. The advantage of the slack belt setup is that you can grind slightly convex surfaces, meaning that the surface transitions down toward the cutting edge with a slight radius. And basically the nature of that radius is going to depend on how hard you press on here. If you press really hard, you start to get a little bit of a steeper radius. The disadvantage of the slack belt feature is that it's just hard to get as much pressure onto the steel as you do with anything that has a hard backing, because as you press into it, the belt tends to cut on that leading edge the most, and as a result you tend to get, if you press really hard, you tend to get uneven grinds on there. However, if you press gently on it, you can get a nice soft radius, and actually for Japanese style blades sometimes that can be a handy little feature. The advantage of a convex grind is that, unlike the traditional Western angled grind, the normal Western grind has a double bevel. There's a bevel that comes down here, and then at the cutting edge, the last tiny little bit, there's a secondary bevel. And that secondary bevel is, just as a matter of simple geometry, going to be a steeper bevel than the angle of the edge itself. As a result, it creates more friction and more resistance to the cut than if you were able to take the grind right smack down to the edge. What the Moran grind or the convex grind allows you to do is to take that grind right on down to the edge, and yet not make it so thin along that edge that the edge is unsupported and weak in the initial stage right after that, right after the cutting edge itself. So definitely something worth experimenting with, and depending on the kind of knife that you make, may be an excellent option for you. There's nothing super tricky with the slack belt feature, except to say that you just can't grind with the same level of pressure that you do on the hard backed, the platen and the wheel and so forth. If you want a smooth grind, you have to just go a little bit slower and be a little bit more patient. Okay, so another useful feature that's kind of underappreciated about the grinder is that you can grind very clean radiuses with different size wheels. So where would you want to do that? We think about the belt grinder especially in the context of making the bevels themselves, but You can also use these wheels to establish very clean, nice shapes, interior grinding shapes in the blade itself. You can also grind little finger grooves by going this way on the handles. So let me just turn this on and I'm going to show you how this might work. So I'm just using this little demonstrator ugly model here, and this is obviously not a finished profile. But as you can see, this would allow you to cut, just using this particular radius that I have right here, allows you to cut some nice little radiuses into the interior surface of that handle there. And there are all kinds of different places that you could use this in the context of any given knife. And of course, you've got different sizes of grinding wheels. You've got the wheels on the slack belt, which are, I would say that's about a 3-inch radius. You've got about a 2.5-inch radius on the sides of the platen. They're actually a slightly different radius than this. You know, find those different radiuses and see where you could use them in a way that would be useful for any particular knife that you're working on. Well, I hope you picked up some useful skills here. Maybe if you're an experienced guy, you picked up a few little techniques that might help you be a little better. And if you're just getting started, hopefully this will give you a little boost that'll get you moving a little faster down the curve of learning about how to grind knives. Thanks for watching, and see you soon. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe to my channel and check out my website, waltersorrellsblades.com, where you can find more of my work. You'll also find plenty more videos there that you can't find on YouTube with very, very detailed information about all aspects of Japanese blade making. Also, like me on Facebook at Walter Sorrells Blades.